How's it going, guys? This is Luke from Coffee House, and today I wanted to talk to you about what 30 years does to a coffee grinder in the coffee world, especially in terms of specialty coffee. So today we're going to jump into this Braun KMM30 versus the fellow Ode. Not because they're the same price point or anything, but they are both Burr grinders that were made in very different eras of the coffee world. Jumping into the Braun KM30 here, this grinder was really a mainstay for the coffee world and the coffee drinker world in the 80s, 90s, and around there. And that's because they were so cheap. These were about 30 to 40 bucks back then. Which would, give you a bang for your buck. You have all the way from a grind selecting standpoint from 1, which is espresso, to 14, which is filter coffee, just like one of the Malconigs. It comes with a nice and large volume grounds bin here, and the actual bean capacity is pretty large as well. Instead of a button to turn on and turn off, there is actually a little timer up front here, which allows you to set for the seconds what you, how much you want to actually grind from here, because this one's not really designed to be a doser grinder, a single dose grinder like this guy over here. This is meant to kind of just hang out. What I want to do is really talk about kind of the functionality of these two grinders, but before I get into that, I'm going to jump into the Ode and kind of compare and contrast the form and function. All right, so we've all seen the fellow Ode. We've done a bunch of videos, and I promise this is the last one, but I wanted to compare this to something that was would take its place about 30 years ago, and today we have the fellow Ode. Much, much heavier, almost entirely made of metal. This grinder provides a lot more stature in the kitchen, and it really kind of stands out as something that looks very well made, whereas the Braun looks, it has that Dieter Rams kind of look to it, but it's not so much the same in terms of the quality there. That being said, the touch points are really amazing. You have the full metal grind selector. It's very silent and very muted, and the button with an audible beep and quiet burrs as well. In comparison to the KMM30 is worlds apart in terms of build quality. So jumping in here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and pour some coffee into here, and we're going to grind it. But before I wanted to do that, I wanted to show you guys a little bit of something that is mainly different between these grinders here, and that's the motor torque in them. What's so great about this fellow in terms of a grindability factor is its low torque motor, which allows it to really grab all of those beans, whereas this one, there's so much torque that you can see it. You can see it rotate there. It's a very high torque motor here, which is not going to allow it to grab the beans like it will this. And so what we're going to do is we're going to throw a timer up on the screen and see how long it's going to take us to grind some of this coffee. So what I'm going to do is, for sound's sake, we're going to put that lid back on, and I'm going to set this to 60 seconds and see how much we can grind. This is 1 minute. Let's go now. All right, so as you can see in the 60 seconds we took, I unfortunately did not get through what we poured into the hopper, which was about 60 grams of coffee. Something that is different and might be a little better than the fellow Ode is there's actually no mess right now, but we can jump into that in a little bit. Taking off the bean hopper here, we start to see a little bit of a mess, a lot of static buildup. And once we get into here, we're really going to kind of see the difference. There is quite a distribution of coffee grounds here. Just looking inside of here, you definitely see some particles that would be great for kind of like a V60 or a light roast pour over, but the actual outside, or this right here, is just coated in fines, in even finer than espresso, which your overall yield is going to be a lot less. I don't know exactly how great this cup of coffee is going to be, given what we were provided in here. And with the time to grind being, probably about 2 minutes for a solid batch of coffee, it's going to take quite a bit of time. So what I'm going to do, jump into the fellow here, and we're going to do the same amount of coffee and see how long that takes. All right, so we have the same volume of coffee in this hopper up here as we did in the Braun grinder. What I'm gonna do is we're gonna throw another timer up and count it out. So as you can see, this fellow oat grinder has made great advancements in its time to grind. This is way, way faster than something like this. And looking inside, we're gonna be able to assess the quality here. And so I know the fellow grinders are messy, like you can see the static in there. There are ways to combat that. You can use kind of like a little wetted spoon and stir in your coffee before to diffuse static. But just, you know, from a comparable standpoint, we're looking at this and we see so much more consistency than we do in the Braun grinder here. What I wanted to talk about today too is I know a lot of people saw our previous video about kind of like the update of the fellow grinder and how, you know, I mean, you could, well, we'll talk about that in a minute, and how we've, you know, been giving it a hard time and everything like that. And I just wanted to show, you know, this kind of video to demonstrate where we have went in the last 30 years. And when I say that the fellow grinder may not stack up to its competitors in certain ways, it still is a great advancement in grinding technology. The difference between these two grinders are very stark just from what I've seen already without tasting the coffee. The consistency is much greater. The static buildup is much less. There are far less fines than there were in the Braun grinder. And I mean, it's so much quieter. It has a lot of great features that the other one doesn't have. And even though it may not grind for espresso, I mean, arguably, does the Braun grinder really grind for espresso anyways? So that being said, what I'd like to do is I'm gonna go ahead and brew these 2 cups of coffee and we're gonna compare. So what I went ahead and did is poured 2 cups of coffee here from these 2 respective grinders. The Braun grinder, it was a lot more difficult to scrap together a sizable dose for a pour over. We ended up doing 25 grams each for both of these, and it took about like a minute and a half on this Braun grinder to get sizable coffee. I already envision this as having kind of like a lighter body, a less extracted overall profile. I'm pretty confident that that's going to be the result that we're going to get out of this cup. This one, on the other hand, I feel it will be a lot more well extracted, and it will have kind of a nicer body and overall better profile and a better kind of source of origin. That being said, let's jump in, taste these 2, and compare. So my suspicions were right. With this Braun grinder here, you know, even though it's got that high torque motor, it really does not stack up to something like the fellow Ode. The Ode, where it is, I know it is 10 times more expensive, but you know, it just goes to show that the advancements are being made in the right direction. We have coffee grinders that are $3,000 nowadays, some that we've compared on this channel. And you know, our goal here is to kind of build a baseline of quality coffee grinders and kind of explain the outliers of the situation. I think, you know, something that was the peak of its design in the 80s, 90s, and something that is now the peak of design in the 2020s, the difference, you know, I mean, they carry the same characteristics in terms of the physical build. Like, these were the hot grinders. These were the ones that really kind of stretched beyond what a regular grinder is. This one having burrs and the simplistic kind of like Bauhaus design, whereas this one is a flat burr set, much better built, and it fits into a higher price bracket that allows people to really stretch their coffee experience at home. The difference is quite huge between these two. The extraction is different, and clearly the fellow Ode stacks up when compared to something like this. And you know, this you could call this the fellow Ode redemption video if you wanted to. Obviously there are issues with the fellow Ode, but these are issues that are so small and when in comparison to something like this. The fellow Ode is the clear winner for anything related to any of these vintage coffee grinders, because there's not really going to be something that was built back then that allows you to have access to the technology that something like this does, whether it's the insulation, the flat burrs, the little knock chute here. A lot of those characteristics will not exist in grinders that were built 30 years ago. I mean, there are a lot of good things to say about this Braun grinder from the physical perspective. I love the look of this. I really stand behind kind of this overall fit and finish on these grinders, and I've always been a big fan of kind of this design aesthetic. It'd be really interesting to maybe take something like this and retrofit it with the internals of one of these, maybe the motor, maybe the Burr set, something like that, that could really allow this to turn out good coffee like this. You know, the design is there, but the internals are dated, clearly. Although these are making kind of like a resurgence in the design world, you know, it's just the fit and finish does not meet the actual mechanical quality of something like this. You know, without further ado, I'd like to wrap this up and kind of conclude with the fact that the Fellow Ode and the Braun KMM30 are worlds apart in terms of coffee quality. And although they were kind of like that peak design during their time period, you know, it really goes to show the advancements that we've made in coffee technology and where we are going forward. You know, these issues that we've talked about with the Fellow Ode really are small fixable opportunities for Fellow to roll out, like a V2 or something like that. And that's exactly what I think they're going to do next, is come out, address the issues that have been made, and you know, make it the perfect grinder that it needs to be. I want to thank you guys for tuning into my little rant about where we've been in the last 30 years. And I'm happy, you know, we got to talk about it. I'm hoping you learned something as well. I'm Luke from Coffee House. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you next time.